Hello, everyone. I hope you are doing great and you're staying safe at home. Um, I miss being with you in class. And you can't imagine how hard is it to talk to the computer than talking to you. But I'll do my best to explain the same things slowly so that you can follow. And if you have any concerns or any problems and things you didn't understand after listening to this video and after looking at the book and reading it. Then if you still didn't get any things, I will post on the Moodle how can you contact me later on, and so that we can see how we'll be able to explain things that you don't understand. Okay, let's start. Today we'll be continuing with chapter 2. So far, we have covered, as you remember, in the last couple of lectures, we have talked about public policy, its definitions, and why we call it public. And then we talked about the stages of the public policy process, starting from the agenda setting till we end up with policy evaluation and change. Okay, so our topic today will be completion of this. We're still about public policy, but we'll be talking about the different types of the policy. We will be talking about 4 types of policies. First is the regulatory policy. Second is the distributive policy. Third is the redistributive. And fourth is the constituent policy. Let's start with the first type of policy, which is called the regulatory policy, or we call it in Arabic سياسات تنظيمية. What do you mean by regulatory policy? If you have a look at the definition, it's defined as the policies that is designed to limit the actions of people or individuals or groups in the society in order to protect, and we underline this word, to protect the general public or a portion of the public. So here, when we are talking about a regulatory, something that a government or a policy that the government is making to regulate, okay, so here we mean we want to put some limitations on the actions of people in order to protect the general public. I think it's still not clear, but let's move on to see the different types of the regulatory policy, and we'll be giving you examples so that you can understand what I mean by it. We can differentiate between 2 types of regulatory policy. The first type is called competitive regulatory, and the second type is called protective regulatory policy. Protective regulatory policy means a policy that regulates some activity in order to protect the general public from a negative effects of a private activity. Again, protective regulatory would mean here, we are talking about a policy that tries to regulate some activity in order, again, to protect, as a key word here, the general public from a negative effects that can come out of a private activity. What does this mean? Let's take an example so that we can make things clearer for you. If you think that the government is trying to make an environmental policy, a new law or a new policy in order to regulate the air pollution. Air pollution, if the factory is polluting the air, that's a negative effect, right? Okay, so if the government tried to make a law or regulation in order to force factories, for example, to put filters or to pay fines if they polluted the air above above the certain percentage or something. So here, look at the keywords of the regulatory policy here. So we're trying, if we are imposing that new policy that's to protect the air pollution, we're trying to prevent a negative effect, which is the air pollution, in order to protect the general public. So here, that's the keyword. I'm making a law, I'm making a policy or regulations to protect the public health, to protect the public from the negative effect that can come out due to the air pollution. Okay, let's take another example. If you're talking about unsafe consumer products, if the government again is also to make a policy or a new law that forces some food industries to abide by certain certificates or ISO certificates, or to write a production date and expiry date, or to preserve certain things that shows that they are producing products with a certain quality. Why the government is doing so? Here it's do so, it does such regulations in order to protect the public from that negative effect that might happen if these regulations are not there. Let's say if the government is not forcing certain industries to abide by an expiry date and a production date, for example, they might not consider it. You might produce expiry products or something. Okay, so here who does not look at the quality or something that's not safe for the consumer. So here I'm trying to protect the public from any negative effects that might come from any private activity if that law is not there. So that's why it's called protective regulatory. I'm regulating in order to protect. Okay? We can expect that business people, of course, might resist such a kind of regulation, right? If you are a businessman, you don't want to pay more for filters to protect the air, or you don't want to abide by such accreditation like ISO or so on, and you pay a lot, so that costs you a lot. So some business people might resist that kind of regulations. That's why we can say that the protective regulatory policy might have some kind of controversial or some kind of conflict before they can be made or they can be enforced. Let me tell you that when we are talking about or comparing between the 4 types of policies, we will be looking at which type of policy that causes the biggest conflict or that's more controversial. So we are comparing them to each other. Of course, when you're making any kind of policy, there might kind of be a conflict like that arises from the different point of views. Like we see the difference when everyone is looking at the public interest from a different perspective. However, still some policies are causing more conflict compared to others. Let's see, and we'll be seeing this later when we are explaining the other types of policies. So the second type of regulatory policy, it's called competitive regulatory policy. Competitive regulatory policy means a policy that aims to limit the provisions of goods and service or the participation in the market to a select group of people or organization. Again, we are making a policy. Let's remember the name, competitive. So here the policy, it wants to make sure that there is a fair and competitive practices in the market. So that's aim of that policy. It regulates in order to make sure that there is a fair competition. Like, for example, and there's that policy that regulates who enters that market and who cannot enter that market. Let's take an example to make things clearer. If you're talking about policies that tries to regulate some professions like medicines or engineering, think about it. If you know any of your friends who is in engineering faculty or something, in order for him after graduations to work, he has to get a license of professions from the engineering syndicates, right? So here we are making a regulation that we are giving the power to these syndicates to decide who will be belonging to that professions or not, okay? And who can be a doctor, a physician, through not just like when you're saying, maybe you are a graduate of a medicine school, but if you still do not have that ID, you will not be able to practice, okay? So here, in that case, when we are talking about comparative regulatory, part of that policy means I'm giving some people with that expert, with that profession, to decide who will be able to participate in that market or not. How does that work? Well, let's get deeper in that so that you can better understand it. If I'm saying, do you remember, like when we're talking about engineering, maybe some people might be a graduate of an institute of engineering and so on, but it's not a high school. It's not a faculty, like a faculty of engineering. So those people, the syndicates does not allow them to get the engineering ID. Why? Because they did not take the same courses. They did not take 5 years like those who are graduates of engineering. They did not take the same level of courses, the same level of practices and so on. So they cannot compete in the market. It's not going to be fair competition for a person who have studied for 3 years in a certain institute to compete with someone who has studied for 5 years. That's not going to be fair. Okay, and because we're talking about a competitive regulatory that ensures fair competition, so that's why I'm giving the right to some institutions to give the license of professions to allow some people to join the market or not, in order to make sure that it's a fair and a competitive practices. Okay, so they are putting some kind of barriers on who can enter that professions and not, in order to limit the number of professionals. Okay, and that's why in that case they can make sure that there is a fair and a competitive practices. If you look at it yourself, that kind of policies does not in general, not too many people of the public will be concerned about, right? So in that case, this is not gonna stimulate a big conflict, or you can say it's just very little public notice. Only those who are in such a profession might be considered about that policy, but the general public will not be concerned a lot about it. That's why we can say that competitive regulatory policy is a type of policy that does not cause a big conflict or controversial. Okay, so that goes for the regulatory policy with its two types. That we can, to sum it up, when we are talking about a regulatory policy, we're talking about a policy that aims to limit, okay, again, limit the actions of groups, to protect the general public. So the two types, whether a competitive or protective, you're trying to limit the actions of the group to protect the general public. And always try to remember the examples, so that like for the first one, remember the example, we're talking about air pollution. And for the second one, protective regulatory, we're talking about, for example, something related to the professions and so on. So with remembering the examples will help you remember the definitions of the policies. Moving on to the second type of policy, which is called distributive policy. Distributive policy means is the policies that intend to distribute the goods or some kind of its benefits to some segments of the society. In fact, distributive policies is the most common form of government policy. It's the type of a policy that the governments are engaged in most of the time. And in that type of policy as well, the government is using the general tax revenues in order to provide such kind of benefits. Again, what does it mean? Let's take an example to make things clear. If we are talking about a health policy, an education policy, a transportation policy, a national spending on local infrastructure policy, all these types of policies are considered distributive policy. Why? Here, I'm distributing the tax revenues to the different sectors, okay, that give them different benefits to some parts or some segments of the society. So if I'm taking the example of education policy, so I'm making a new educational policies for kindergartens or for high school or some. So it's some segments of the society. It does not for the whole. Not everyone will be affected, but it's part of the distributive policies. Distributive policies in Arabic, it's called سياسات توزيعية. Okay, so I'm kind of distributing the tax revenues on the different segments or in the different types of general policies, okay? And I usually do this during the budget making process. So when we are distributing the budget, we're actually just making a kind of distributive policies. So if you're taking the example, if you remember, I think we have referred to something similar to this in one of our lectures before. Like when I said, the government often creates public goods in the sense that all citizens can enjoy. So I mean, it can be provided for all, but it's not necessary that everyone will be using it, right? How is that possible? Let's take an example. If I'm talking, for example, about the national park, okay? National park located in Giza, okay? So it's national park, so it's a public good, so any citizens, any person can use and can get into that park, right? So if I'm living in Nasr City, that national park is actually very far from me. It's not very common that I will be using it. But if it happens that I came to Giza, I can still get in, and something that cannot prevent me from entering. So that's also a characteristics of the distributive policy when we are talking about the distributions of public good. Well, unlike the regulatory policy here, and because the benefits of distributive policies are actually made to people or different groups of the society, okay, without forcing anyone else who does not have an impact on a group other than the others, meaning that the cost is not felt by other groups in the society, we can say that there is a little conflict over distributive policy. What does it mean? It means that, as I said, when we are comparing between types of policies, we are trying to have a look which type of policy is the one that causes the biggest conflict or the biggest controversial. So when we are talking about distributive policy, we are saying that kind of policy does not cause a lot of conflict. Why? Because we are talking about people who are benefiting from these services. No one bears that cost. We are talking about the distributions of the tax revenues, the distribution of the budget. So it's not felt that much like when we are talking about the protective regulatory. We talked about the businesses will be having a kind of more cost, and that's why they might resist that kind of regulatory policies. But here we are talking about distributive policy. There's not that such a kind of conflict because we're talking about benefits for the people, for the general people, without preventing some groups from benefiting from it. Yes, there might be a little bit conflict when we are talking about the distribution during the time of distribution of the budget itself, because maybe the Ministry of Education want to get a big portion of the budget compared to the Ministry of Transportation, was looking also to increase its budget for the coming year and so on. But that kind of is not, we cannot say that's considered a big conflict. That's why we still call it a little conflict over distributive policy, because the people themselves will not be involved in such kind of conflict. Okay? Moving on to the third type of policy, which is called the redistributive policy, or we can call it in Arabic سياسات إعادة التوزيع. Redistributive policy, it's the policy that gives a benefit to one group by imposing a cost on another group. Again, it's a policy that benefits one group and imposes a cost on another group. It takes taxes from certain groups and gives them to another groups. It's a policy that benefits the less advantaged at the expense of the advantage. What does it mean? Let's take an example also to make things clear. If we are talking about progressive taxation, for example, okay? Progressive taxation means you're imposing more taxes on the rich people and you're using that money to help the poor people. So here you are imposing a cost on some group to benefit another group. You are taking taxes from certain groups to help or give it to another group. So that's why rich people for sure will be resisting such a kind of policy. If you're talking about aid to poor cities or social welfare programs All these policies are called redistributive. Redistributive means I'm trying to redistribute the wealth. I'm trying to take from those who have to give it to those who have not. I'm trying to take from the advantaged people to help the disadvantaged people. Okay, so that's why it's called redistributive, because I'm talking about redistribution of wealth. Of course, I'm assuming that now, when you're talking about whether it's going to be causing a high conflict or more conflict or not, I'm expecting that most of you are saying now, of course, it will be the type of policy that is causing the highest conflict or highest controversial possible compared to other types of policies. And why is that again? Because here we can talk about winning, win, lose. Some group wins, some groups lose. And you are either a winner or a loser. Because some you're taking from those, again, we are saying, when we're talking about redistributive, we're talking from those who have to give it to those who have not. So those who have will be paying a lot, so they will be disadvantaged, so they will be not satisfied, so they will be resisting. And those who have, those kind of people who are going to receive the benefits, of course, they will be happy, but the other group will not. So we have some group who wins and some group who lose. Some group who benefits and some groups who lose. That's why that kind of redistributive policy is the type of policy that causes the biggest conflict, because you are giving power to the less powerful at the expense of the powerful people or the rich people, wherever they are. Okay, so that's type of policy again is the type of policy that causes the biggest conflict. Moving on to the last type of policy, which is called the Constituent Policy. That type of policy is, remember it with the examples like foreign policy, defense policy, anti-terrorism policy. It's a policy that intended to benefit the public in general. So something that benefits the public generally without any discriminations against or not to certain segments of the people or the others, like compared to, for example, to the distributive policy, when we are talking about education, so we're having some people will be benefiting from education. So if you're not going to be educated, you're not going to enter the school, so you're not going to benefit from such a policy. If you're talking about a transportation policy or a health insurance policy, some groups will be benefiting, others not. But here, when we are talking about constituent policy, like foreign policy, it's for everyone. You cannot determine if when the government changes its foreign policy or make a new foreign policy, it affects everyone. You cannot determine which group. The same goes for the defense policy. Same goes for anti-terrorism policy. So all these are considered constituent policy. Also, part of the constituent policy is the policy that intends to serve the government, okay? Meaning you are making a new legislations that is affecting the structure and the function of the government. You are making a policy to decide how different operations inside the government are running, okay? So to sum it up for this part, before we move on to another point, we have talked so far about 4 types of public policy: regulatory policy, distributive policy, redistributive, and constituent. As for the regulatory policy, we mentioned it's a type of policy that intended to limit, again we're talking about keywords, limit the actions of people or groups to protect the general public from a negative effect that might happen. For the distributive policies, the second type, we talked about a policy that intends to distribute different benefits to some segments or groups of the people, and we said it's the most common type of policy that the government is involved on, and it's done during the budget making process. And for the third type, we talked about redistributive policy, and we refer to the type of policy that aims to redistribute the wealth, and it takes from those who have to give those who have not. And for the last type, we talk about the Constituent Policy. We said that it intends to benefit the public in general, okay? And we give examples like foreign policy or defense policy. And when we are saying which type of policies that causes the biggest conflict or that have a high controversial, the answer will be, of course, the redistributive policy. And why is that again? Because it gives, we have a winner and a loser at this group. We are trying to benefit the disadvantage at the expense of the advantaged people. Okay, let's have a look at this. Let's see. If you're having a policy, I'm asking you here to determine which type of policy is this. We have 3 policies here. The first one, the characteristics of the policy, it's a collective public provision. There is a kind of consensus, there is no oppositions. Examples are general tax reduction. Okay. The second type of policy has a characteristic that talks about relation between costs and benefits. Is very obvious. It has a conflict, polarization between winners and losers, and examples include progressive taxation, labor market, and social assistance that's imposed by the states. The third type of policy, legal norms for behavior interaction. The characteristics, there is a changing coalition according to the distribution of costs and benefits. People might agree and collate in a certain point of time, depending on the cost and benefits, and sometimes they may not collate. Coalition might change. Okay, examples include consumer protection, safety at work, protection of the environment, and again, it's imposed by the state. What do you think will be the type of each one of them? Take a second to think about it. Okay. Let's see. So let's start from down here. When we are talking about example of protection of the environment, we said always remember the examples will help you remember the definition. I'm talking about protection of the environment, safety or consumer protection. So I'm talking about regulatory policy, right? Protective regulatory policy. And changing coalitions, it depends on the cost and benefits. Some people would agree to that policy, some people would not. So yeah, I'm trying to regulate, again, to limit the actions to protect the general public. So that's type called of regulatory policy. The second one here, progressive taxations, social assistance. I'm helping those who, I'm taking from those who have to give those who have not. I'm helping the disadvantage at the expense of the advantage. I'm having a winner and a loser. I'm having polarizations. I'm having a winner and a losers. I'm having a conflict. Then we are talking about redistributive policy. And the last one here, there's a kind of consensus, collective public provision, general kind of policies. We are talking about distributive policies. Okay, I hope that the parts of policies are very clear. Please refer to the book, your textbook, and read them carefully. Okay, read the examples in your book about the different types of policies to make sure that you can understand them well and you can differentiate between the 4 types of policies. Okay, moving on to a second part. We are still saying the same chapter. We are coming back again to talk about the sources of bureaucratic power. Again, bureaucrats in the public policy process have a kind of power. Where does this power come from? Different sources. Many of them, or the first one I'm sure that comes to your mind, is the expertise and the knowledge and the information that they have and others might lack, right? And again, another type of power is related to the discretionary power that is devoted to them. Do you remember the discretionary power that we have talked about a lot, that we are giving the bureaucrats some kind of discretionary power to give them the kind of flexibility, because we cannot come back and change the law every now and then when conditions are changed. So we need to give them that kind of flexibility so that they can adapt to change and respond to the changing conditions quickly if they discover new information and so on, without again having to get back to the parliament to make a new law or to make an amendment to the law. So that kind of discretionary power devoted to them give them a kind of big kind of power. So that through their expertise, through their discretionary power, the bureaucrats are helping actually, in fact, the public agencies in the making of the public policy. And when we are talking about the sources of power, we will still be differentiating between two types of power: the internal sources of power and the external sources of power. Let's start with the internal sources, because we have already referred to part of it when we have talked about the information and so on, the discretionary power. Internal sources of power comes from, here we are talking, remember that we are talking about the factors that affect their power. When the bureaucrats have informations, when they have that kind of expertise, that gives them more power. That gives them more power that they can affect the public policy in a big extent. Cohesion. What do you mean by cohesion here? When members of a certain public organizations are already united, have a sense of cohesion between their members, that gives them more power compared to other institutions. Even look at yourself as a group. When you have a certain group of friends that are always united, that are always have a kind of cohesiveness between them, and compared to another group, you can see a big difference in the impact of the group whose members are actually united and so on, so they can have a bigger impact on the policy making and on other factors around the world compared to those who are not united. So that kind, when the organizations or the public organizations or the members of the bureaucrats of their organizations are actually united and have a sense of cohesion, that gives them more power compared to other institutions. A fourth source of internal power, it's called effective and strong leadership. When you have an effective leader, when you have a strong leader, that gives your bureaucratic organizations more power compared to others, even compared to another bureaucratic institutions. So we are talking about the bureaucratic power. Remember what we are talking about, the titles that we are talking about factors that might affect the power of the bureaucrats. That means if they are there, the bureaucrats will have more power and have more impact. If they are not there, the bureaucrats will have less power. So it's expected, and by nature, if you have a strong leader, if you have an effective leader for your organizations, this means that you have a more power. Moving on to the external source of power. How can the bureaucrat have external sources of power? It's easy to understand that the information, the expertise, having a strong leadership and cohesions might give the bureaucrat power. But how about external sources? How can this give you more power? Imagine that the public or the public opinion are actually supporting your organizations. This gives your organization, of course, more power. Let's assume that if you are public organizations or the bureaucrats working in environmental issues, and now you are working on a new policy related to protection of the environment, and it happens that most of the people or the public opinion are actually in favor of such a new policy. Because, for example, they found that the air now is very polluted and many people are getting sick because of that. So they are actually supporting the environmental institutions, public institutions working on a new regulations to protect the environment, compared, for example, to another even public institutions that's are talking about growth and more factories, more industries that on the other hand might cause more pollutions. So in that case, your institution working in environment will be having more power gaining more bureaucratic power because you are having the public opinion on your back, you're having the support of the public opinion. So the more the public opinion support you, the more powerful you are. A second source of external power is the support of the members of the legislatures. Now, the more you have parliamentarians who are actually supporting your regulations, and supporting your institutions, then the more power that you have. That also gives you more power. A third source of external power is when you have support from other members in the executive. What does it mean? If you are, let's say, if I'm talking still again about the environment and I'm making a new environmental law, and it happens that Ministry of Planning and Economic Development are actually supporting me, and it happens that the Ministry of Education are supporting me, and it happens that the Ministry of Transportation are supporting me. So I'm gaining support from different members inside the executive. So that gives me more power compared if I was talking or working alone. So here, if I'm having the external sources of power, if I'm having the public support me, if I'm having members of the parliament, if I'm having other members in the executive, that gives me more power. So the more external sources of power that I can have, the more powerful I will be as a bureaucratic institutions or as a public institution. Okay, so if I'm having only the public opinion, or if I'm having only the member of the legislature, that's not enough. The more sources of power I gain as an institution, the more powerful I will be. Okay, so to sum it up, that point, again, we are talked about the factors that can affect the bureaucratic power. What can give the bureaucratic institutions more power? What can give it less power? So to gain more power as a bureaucracy, you're going to look at your internal sources of power. Do we have the information? Do we have the expertise needed? Are we united? Do we have a cohesion? How about our leadership, and is it strong and effective? If you're having this, we are gaining more power. And external sources of power, does the public opinion support us? Does the public opinion support us? How about members of legislatures? How about other members in the executive? So the more sources of power you have, the more powerful the bureaucratics or the bureaucracy will be. Okay? Moving on to the last part that we're gonna refer to in that chapter, it's just called about the relationship with the legislature. How about the relationship of the bureaucrats with the legislatures? We have talked about, do you remember when we talked about the public policy cycle, and we've talked about the role that the bureaucrats can play in the policy cycle? We said they might participate in the agenda setting phase by raising issues and so on. They also still can participate in the formulation stage with the information, the expertise they have. And we said their main role, of course, comes when it comes to the implementation. They are the main one responsible for the implementation of the public policy, and they still also can help when it comes to the evaluation and change. Okay? So how about the relationship with the executive, with the legislature? Okay, we can say that. Do you remember the accountability issues that we have talked about in chapter 1? And when we talked about that, bureaucrats are actually implementing the policies, and they are accountable to the legislature, who are accountable to the people who are elected them. So here, when we are talking about accountability, administrators or bureaucrats are accountable before the legislatures, right? They check on them to make sure that they have done their job, they have implemented the policies the way it should be. So how the legislatures can do this? How can they exert some kind of control over the administrative agencies? We can take some examples, or some examples of the tools through which the legislatures can actually have some kind of control over the administrative agencies, over the bureaucrats, over the public employees. First tool that the legislatures might use, it's called legislative veto. Legislative veto means when I'm making a legislation, okay, it means, let me give you an example first, so that you can understand what you mean by okay. Back to the point when we are talking about the legislative veto. Legislative veto means it's a provision in a law that says that any actions that's proposed by the executive or any administrative agency has to be approved or disapproved by the parliament within 30 to 90 days. Meaning that it's a provision in a law. You have a law, whatever type of law, whatever type of regulations that states in that law that you have to get back to the parliament to approve or disapprove that point if you made any changes. Let's take an example. The law, for example, might authorize a new highway, okay? But it requires the legislative consent to undertake specific project. If you want to make any changes in that road or in that new highway, you have to get back to get the approval of the parliament. So that, of course, the legislative veto does not apply to all types of laws. Okay, it's you can say it applies to certain types of laws or specific laws that the parliament sees that it's very important for it to approve or disapprove any changes or any points related to that law. Okay, so in that way they can exert control over the bureaucrats. Another type or tool that they can use, it's called sunset laws. Sunset means that it's a law, type of law that assumes that some government programs should be terminated periodically and will not be able to continue that kind of program only after that a kind of evaluation of the program first and a vote by the legislator. What does that mean? Again, when we are talking about sunset laws, it means we are talking about type of laws that says that these programs will not continue until they are evaluated by the parliament to check whether they are effective or not. Otherwise, they will be terminated or closed. The purpose of that type of law in order to make sure that there is a kind of a careful evaluation of these programs at some point in the future. However, I'm sure that some of you will be thinking, isn't it one of the stages of the public policy process is about evaluation? So why we are making a kind of laws or certain type of laws that requires periodic evaluation? Okay, periodic evaluation means here, like we say,